And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Welcome to episode 3 of the book of Genesis, where we enter into the first day of creation with one of the most classic lines of the Bible. And as familiar as that one line might be, "Let there be light," and there was light, there's a lot to look at up close in the Hebrew and the cultural context as we've been exploring already. So let's jump right into the first day of creation. So, as we've been talking about, this text is almost certainly written during the Babylonian exile. And one of the aspects that we want to be looking at all the way through both Genesis 1 and through the whole primeval history, and even beyond, are the ways that the authors of Genesis from exile in Babylon are trying to counter for their audience the worldview presented in the Babylonian creation story, Enuma Elish. And last session, I noted that link to the Enuma Elish, and again, if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to at least read through the summary so you know what the basic story is. For our purpose today, one of the key points is the difference in how things are created, and as we'll see, the order of things that are created. So in Enuma Elish, as you can see from this little table, it starts with two primal parent gods and their children gods, and after a violent battle between the child god Marduk and the mother goddess Tiamat, creation comes to be. So in other words, the Babylonian Empire, which gained its power through violence, claiming divine authority for that violence, is claiming that that kind of violence of creation is built right into the very structure of it, even before there were human beings. So a worldview or violent power of kings and gods enables things to come to be. Genesis, as we'll see, could hardly be the more opposite view, where the God that we'll see here speaks things into being. And of course, there's only one God, something we might tend to take for granted when we're in the biblical worldview, but that was actually a pretty radical position, and we'll see later in Genesis how that contrasts, not only with the Enuma Elish, but with the Canaanite world that the Israelites dealt with when they were in the land of their promise. So let's begin to look closely at this in light of the structure as we showed last time. And I'll put this on the full screen so you can see it a little more fully here. So the first 3 days are parallel to the second 3 days. So we'll see on day 1 there's light, and on day 4 the lights of sun and moon. On day 2 the sky, and on day 5 the animals that move into the sky and the waters, like the birds, and the third day dry land with vegetation and such, and then that'll be land animals and humans as well. So on day 1 we have light made, and then we'll see here this refrain, evening and morning, evening and morning. Not every time does God say that is good. We'll look at that a little more closely in a moment. And then finally, over in this column, I just want to note some things that link the sections of the different days together in ways that would not be obvious to a reader, either in English or in Hebrew, unless you were alert to such things, which is that in this text that has 7 being the number of the completion of the first unit of time for God's creation and God's rest, multiples of 7 uses of words are found many times through here, something we might not think of as a way to write in English, but we'll see is very common in the Bible, and especially in Genesis in particular. So we'll see that the noun that we looked at last time, Elohim for God, is multiples of 7, 35 times total. Heaven, which is the sky or the dome, is 21 times, and earth is 21 times, all multiples of 7. We'll see here light, or in Hebrew, as we'll look at in a moment, 5 times in this section, representing the 5 books of the Torah, according to some readings. Light plus day 7 times, good 7 times, let there be 7 times. Even though let there be does not correspond to each of the days, because there are only 6 days of creation, so we'll see there are 2 let there be's in one day. So that's part of the pattern of what we're going to see throughout this, throughout our reading here. So I'll put it up so that you can see the Hebrew transliterated in case you want to follow that along with me here. Although, again, I encourage you to use Bible Hub or a similar website to explore that yourselves. So, then God said, "Let there be light." This is happening right after, as we saw last time, there's this tohu vabohu, the translation here, formless void, of the situation that God is going to create out of. So we see there's this wind or spirit from God sweeping over, and then out of that suddenly God speaks. And it's really important for us not to take that for granted in 2 levels. One is that the God of the Bible, in this case Elohim, can speak. We're so used to taking it for granted that In the prophets, perhaps God says, or thus says the Lord, or thus says Yahweh. And yet in our modern world here in 2021, do we think of a God as having a voice to speak? Certainly at one level this is an anthropomorphized view of God. God obviously doesn't speak in the way that we speak, by having a mouth and letting air vibrate across things and having sound come out that forms language. But there's some sense in which language is primal here to how God creates, and in contrast to the violence. The very fact that the authors chose to write a book to tell their story rather than to engage in a war with monuments the way the Babylonians often did, and the Egyptians and many others as well, says something about the power of language to create worlds, both the physical world and the world of living within the covenant, as we'll see later. So God speaks and says, "Let there be," and this verb is one that is used regularly in the imperative. But as many commentators, in this case the one in my notes says, it's really a being that implies a becoming. The light is coming to be, but it will become, because it will alternate with the darkness, as we'll see, and create this rhythm called day in verse 5. But we have to pause for a moment here to recognize that already Genesis is a challenge to those who would try to take it literally. Because we see here that there's light, and this will end, this unit we're looking at, verses 3 to 5, will end with the first day. But of course, what is a day when there's no sun? Because a sun won't be made until day 4. So the authors are plainly not worried about trying to provide consistency with what would be obvious to their audience as well as it is to ours, that the daylight comes when the sun is up, and when there's no sun, there's no light. Certainly, especially in a world without artificial light of electricity, the only other light they might have had would have been firelight, or of course starlight. But with no objects in the sky yet, there is none of that kind of light, and there's certainly nothing like fire so far. So this is a different kind of light, a light that doesn't match anything that we would think of as light, other than the fact that it allows for the creation of light and darkness. So that's a paradox if we try to take it literally, but as you said last time, this is a poem. It's trying to present a poetic, expressive way of contrasting God's creating of the world with the Enuma Elish's creating of the world, not trying to provide facts to counter modern arguments about evolution and the age of the earth and such. So let there be light, the Hebrew word or here, and curiously, it's 5 times in this scene, but it's rare in the rest of Genesis, as we see. In my notes, I'll often have these things in purple, which are hyperlinked, but they'll tell us how many times a given Hebrew word is used either in Genesis or throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And that'll tell us whether the authors are using a special word or a word that is very common. So in this case, it's only in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, notice the Torah, one other time, although it's 120 times in Hebrew Bible. That's something to pay attention to, of what a special word for light. In a way, it corresponds to the bush that Moses has his experience at. That word for bush there in Hebrew, sedah, is only there altogether. This is not the only use of or in the Bible, but it's focused in this particular place. And so God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. So something is responding. It's not clear who God is speaking to. Many people would suggest the heavenly council, although we haven't seen anything like a heavenly council so far. The only indication of such a thing is from later evidence when God speaks in the plural, and from parallel cultural formations from monarchies of the time. But we don't know that as readers yet. We just know there's Elohim speaking. And it appears, and we don't know how it appeared, or we don't know what it is, but God evaluates its quality and says it's good, tov in Hebrew, and we'll see that all the way through in this refrain. And that's something very important and has profound implications, especially for later Christian theology, which saw the created world as somehow evil or sinful, something that's something of a test of our moral character and our faithfulness to God to get through till we get to some other place. But the authors of Genesis do not see creation that way at all. These are not later medieval or Platonic philosophers reading the Bible through that lens. These are Judahites in their time context in the Babylonian exile, reading it through their lens, and therefore they see that this light is good and all creation is good. And we'll see how that's also going to contrast with the Enuma Elish, where the creation apart from cities is deemed dangerous and scary and something to be avoided. So right away, creation is good. And then God does something else directly. God says, let there be light, and the light appears some cause we don't know. But then it says, as if God is doing it directly, God separated the light from the darkness. And we'll see that throughout this section, throughout the whole of Genesis 1, separating allows things to come into being. And this, of course, is consistent with what physicists would say as well. Whether it's the difference between matter and energy, or between one elemental particle and another, or between one living being and another, all of the matter and energy from the Big Bang was one unit, and then once it exploded out, it began to separate into different coagulated units that we'd call stars and planets and various other things along the way. So not speaking to the Big Bang, but consistent with the Big Bang, that light appears first, and then things begin to separate into component parts. And then finally, so God says, let there be, gives a command, God separated, and then God names. And that's something important to pay attention to here, because in the Garden of Eden story, God will delegate naming to the Adam, to name creatures there and to see what the Adam does with the earth creatures. So there's going to be a tension here between God's power to call things, to name things, and human power to name things. Whether it's good or bad that humans name things, we'll see along the way. But God will not only name things in creation, we'll see God also change the names of people, like Abram to Abraham, and a mysterious being, God or an angel or who knows what, changing Jacob's name to Israel much later in the story. So God called the light day. And again, this is curious, since there is no sun yet, but the rhythm of the poem calls for days all the way through. So God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Notice that, like the light being good, the darkness is not evil. There's no sense here that light is good and darkness is evil. Darkness is part of God's creation. It's been separated from the light. And we'll see that God will act in the darkness. He'll encounter Abraham in chapter 15 in the darkness. And so this will not carry either racist or other connotations that we often carry in Western culture, where darkness or blackness is bad or evil and white and lightness is good. Right now, everything is good, and it will be throughout this chapter. So the light is called day, and the darkness is called night. And then we get this refrain, evening, erev in Hebrew, and then morning, boker in Hebrew. And you notice that after this story, which is, say, after Genesis 1, a number of times elsewhere, the first day. And literally in Hebrew, Yom Echad means day one. So we're talking about cardinal numbers versus ordinal numbers, but there's something that separates out this first day as, well, primal. So it's literally day one, and then it'll become the second day, the third day, etc. So this first day establishes three elements about who God is and how God works. God can speak and command things into being. God can separate things that are created into their component parts, and God can name things. And I guess four things, really, because then God can evaluate the quality of God's own creation and call it good. Again, this will contrast in the Garden of Eden story with God saying it's not good, lo tov in Hebrew, for the Adam to be alone. And that's part of God's doing too, but God will remedy that by creating another creature. But that's a few sessions away when we get to chapter 2 and to chapter 3. So that's our first day of creation. We'll see how, as we move into the second day of creation, things will become more complex, as we would expect. And again, you might be surprised, or not, as the case may be, to see how in many ways the order of creation in Genesis 1 would fit what we know from science through the Big Bang and through other evolutionary theories. So we'll move into that more in our next session on episode 4. See you then. Bye-bye.